Good afternoon and welcome to the Middle States Commission on Higher Education's webinar, Submitting a Complex Substantive Change Request, sponsored by Watermark. We would like to remind everyone that this presentation remains the property of the Commission, and the reproduction, distribution, or transmission of the presentation in part or in whole is expressly prohibited without prior written consent from the Commission. For permission requests, email the Commission at president@msche.org. And if you have specific questions related to your institution, you should reach out to your Commission Vice President Liaison. Before we begin, we would like to take a moment to recognize the sponsor of today's webinar, Watermark. Watermark's higher education software solutions give faculty, administrators, and staff the insights they need to improve, evolve, and empower student success. Their integrated digital solutions support assessment and accreditation, faculty activity reporting, course evaluation and surveys, student retention, and catalog and curriculum management. In addition to supporting today's webinar, Watermark will be joining us as a gold sponsor at the 2022 MSCHE Annual Conference this December 7th through 9th in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Thank you, Watermark. On behalf of the Middle States Commission on Higher Education, we would like to welcome you to this webinar. I am Carmela Smith, Vice President for Accreditation Services, and co-presenting with me today are Dr. Tracy Snyder, Senior Vice President for Legal Affairs and General Counsel, and Dr. Ina Corbett, Lead Vice President for Institutional Field Relations. In this training, we will be going through the major components of the complex substantive change process. I will begin with a brief overview of what is substantive change. Tracy will then discuss how the Commission defines complex substantive change and its review process. She will also go over some legal terminology and transaction types associated with a complex substantive change. Ina will speak to some of the requirements and timelines for the complex substantive change preliminary review and the complex substantive change requests. The learning objectives for this training are to, first, understand the purpose of the complex substantive change preliminary review form. Next, understand the submission process and timeline for review and action by the Commission. And lastly, understand the terminology and types of transactions related to the complex substantive change. Let's start with what is substantive change and why is it required. Certain types of institutional changes are considered substantive under United States Department of Education regulation. These changes require Commission review of a substantive change request and action prior to implementation. The changes are not included in the institution's scope of candidate or accreditation status. Failure to comply can impact Title IV financial aid programs. The substantive change policy is accompanied by two procedural documents: the substantive change procedures and the complex substantive change procedures, which have step-by-step information on the substantive change and complex substantive change processes. The guidelines give descriptions of each type of change and includes examples. For detailed information on the substantive change policy, procedure, and guidelines, see the Commission's website under Policies. The MSCHE website has a dedicated web page for substantive change that includes forms for institutions and peer evaluators, fees associated with each type of change, and links to resources related to substantive change. The Commission's fees for substantive change are broken down into a tiered model with a fee determined by the complexity of the type of change and the process for review. you will notice that the complex substantive change is in Tier 5, the most complicated type of change. I will now turn it over to Tracy to talk about how the Commission defines complex substantive change.
Thank you, Carmela. The Commission describes a complex substantive change as a proposed change which requires more in-depth review or requires the Commission to assign or engage a peer evaluator who has specialized professional expertise, for example, accounting or legal expertise. As you can imagine, changes in legal status, form of control, or ownership are always considered complex. However, in addition to these, any of the types of substantive changes may be considered complex, depending on the nature and scope of the change at the discretion of the Commission staff. And examples include, but are not limited to, a change in the status of multiple locations, multiple types of change that are submitted simultaneously, and some institutional closures. This is a graphic of the overall complex substantive change process, which has 4 major components. And I will go through each of these components on this slide and the slides to follow. Overall, the Commission's review can take 1 year from the time the request form is submitted. I have added some very broad estimated timeframes for each component, and it's certainly worth repeating that each situation is different and each timeline will be different. But I do hope this helps you to understand the submission process and the general timeline. The process really begins with early notification. And we ask that you please notify your Vice President Liaison as soon as possible and as soon as you understand that one of these transactions could be a real possibility for your institution. Within 2 to 6 months, you should be ready to submit a preliminary review form, and that is the second stage in the graphic. I know this is a wide range, but you want to have good information and some assurances that the transaction is going to move forward. The Vice President Liaison will outline a realistic schedule for review that takes the circumstances and the progress that your institution has made into consideration. The next due date and the next step in the graphic is for submission of the substantive change request form. This step could be in 4 to 6 months. During this review, it's highly likely that the institution will be asked for additional information, and this could certainly impact the schedule. The final step upon submission is the Commission's review. And in accordance with our policy and procedures, the Commission will complete the review 1 year from the date of the submission of this request form. I want to mention that there are monitoring activities that will occur after the Commission's action and even after the final transaction date. The Commission may ask for follow-up reporting to collect any outstanding documentation or approvals. We must have those on file. Finally, a complex substantive change site visit is required within 6 months of the transaction date. On the next slides, I'll talk about each of these stages in more detail. In the early notification stage, the institution should notify its designated Vice President Liaison as soon as it is aware of a potential institutional change that may meet the definition of a complex substantive change. As mentioned, this notification really should occur as early in the planning process as possible, and it may occur informally via phone call or email. Sometimes, the institution is not sure if its change is a complex substantive change. The Vice President Liaison can provide preliminary advice to the institution about whether or not a proposed change would be considered complex under the Commission's definition. The Vice President Liaison will provide the institution with relevant policies, procedures, guidelines, and a link to the complex substantive change preliminary review form. The institution should always establish good communication with the Vice President Liaison throughout this process, notifying them at any time along the way of revisions or amendments to a complex substantive change. Let the VP Liaison know if an expected arrangement falls through, changes directions, or the institution decides not to continue. The preliminary review form is also available on the Commission's website. You will find it under number 2 in the Types of substantive changes, and request forms shown on this slide, which depicts the tiered model Carmela discussed earlier. The preliminary review form is a very important component in the review. It is the first stage where the Commission will be able to provide guidance about the steps of the anticipated transaction, the terminology being utilized, and all necessary approvals. The preliminary review form is first reviewed by the Vice President Liaison. The form provides us with critical information so that we can understand the potential change. It is a preliminary form, so it should be done as soon as possible after the early notification. And you should provide as much information as is currently available about the proposed change. One purpose of the preliminary review form is to shape and inform the rest of the review. At this stage, the Policy and Legal Affairs units will also review the preliminary review form. We will be able to make recommendations to the institution to adjust or refine the plan to minimize problems during the Commission's review. Legal review focuses on the legal documents and understanding the legal aspects of the transaction. The Vice President Liaison will take the review feedback provided by the Policy and Legal Affairs units and provide written feedback and guidance to the institution for the subsequent submission of the substantive change request form. In addition to this feedback, the Vice President Liaison will develop a preliminary schedule for the duration of the accreditation decision-making process and the Commission's review. The schedule will contain due dates for any additional information that is requested by Commission staff, including the Policy Unit and Legal Affairs Unit. We'll establish a realistic due date for the submission of the substantive change request form. This, of course, will depend on progress that has been made on due diligence, formation of the legal documents or agreements, any exploratory studies, or other project milestones that are relevant for the type of transaction being proposed by the institution. Typically, the institution needs a little bit of time to work on these things prior to submitting the request form. And this process is really important for the institution to begin to think through a plan for the transition. As a Commission, we have heard from institutions that the process of submitting the preliminary review form has assisted greatly with planning and developing a scenario and cohesive vision for the project, in addition to understanding the components of the Commission's review. The first section of the preliminary review form is for a comprehensive description of the proposed change. We ask for you to provide as much information as is currently available. The form does ask about the specific type of transaction, which we will discuss in more detail in a little bit. It will also ask you to identify if any additional substantive changes are related. We sometimes see the opening or closing of branch campuses or a change in mission that are related to the complex substantive change, and they must also be approved. The needs analysis should describe how the need for the project was identified, including the types of activities that were used to collect information. You may have conducted exploratory studies, you may have plans, surveys, or market analyses that support your vision for this project. The preliminary timeline should identify the stages of the transaction and the anticipated timing at each stage. Likewise, there should be legal documents that support each stage, which I will talk about on the next slide. I'd like to make a note here about the importance of terminology utilized to describe the transaction. You will be asked to select the type of transaction, as there are many different types of changes in legal status, form of control, or ownership. It is critical that terminology be carefully selected and consistently utilized throughout the transaction. The terminology utilized in the legal documents should be the same as the terminology utilized in the narrative portions of the submission. This is one of the reasons why the preliminary review form is so important. For example, upon completing the preliminary review form, you may select the type of transaction to be an acquisition. However, in the narrative description and the legal documents, the transaction may actually appear to be a merger. The Commission can notify you that the transaction appears to be a merger and not an acquisition. The Commission always reserves the right to identify and define the type of transaction in accordance with the Commission's definitions. Most people have an adverse reaction when I mention legal documents. What you need to know is that most transactions related to a complex substantive change are accompanied by agreements or specific legal documents between the parties involved in the transaction. Your institution's legal counsel will be the one to provide you with guidance. We do not prescribe what is to be contained in these legal documents. However, we do review them carefully. And it is helpful to be aware of the need for these legal documents, as they tell a great deal about the type of transaction that's occurring. And the legal documents play a big role in identifying the next steps. The Commission provides a typical set of legal documents for each type of transaction in the Substantive Change Guidelines, and I provided a screenshot of that here. Using this as a guide, find out about any legal documents that have been drafted and provide them in the submission. If the institution knows or expects certain documents to be drawn up, then list those and an expected date that they will be available. The institution should be prepared to eventually submit at least a draft version of all required legal documents in the substantive change request form. The legal documents appropriate at each stage are specific to the type of transaction. So just as a quick example, if we look at the table for an acquisition in the first row of this image, you can see that the typical legal documents include organizational charts, an asset purchase agreement, and partnership agreements. An acquisition may require amended articles or certificates of incorporation and possibly amended bylaws if the governance structure will change. It may not, and if not, these documents may not need to be amended. The next section of the preliminary review form is about continued compliance with Commission standards, and here we're outlining 3 specific standards: mission and goals, planning, resources, and institutional improvement, and governance, leadership, and administration. In relation to Standard 1, the Commission is looking for alignment between the institutions or entities involved in terms of mission, program, or educational offerings, student focus, culture, fit, or values. This doesn't mean that only like or similar institutions can undergo a complex substantive change. But it does mean that there should be a good justification for the partnership and vision for the project. In relation to Standard 6, the institution will provide an analytical narrative assessing the financial implications of the change. The primary purpose here is to assess the financial viability of the change and see how the finances may look combined. A pro forma is a document that is commonly used for this purpose. You may have commissioned a study or hired a consultant to look at the financial implications, and you can submit those as evidence. Even though member institutions would submit separate preliminary review forms, the same combined pro forma or joint evidence can be submitted by both institutions if that is appropriate. In relation to Standard 7, Governance, Leadership, and Administration, the preliminary review form asks the institution to describe how the complex substantive change might impact the control, ownership, governance of the institution, including any changes in the institution's governance structure or governing body. You will need to provide the institution's existing governance documents, such as articles of incorporation, bylaws, or other founding documents. These are critical to the Commission's review and understanding how the institution is structured and the kinds of changes that are permitted to occur under these founding documents. At this point, we ask that you also begin to think about how the governance structure will be changed and what kinds of changes to the founding documents will need to be made. These kinds of changes can take time and will require legal guidance. If changes occur, you can describe them in the substantive change request form that you will submit later. You will be required to submit any amended governing documents. The form also asks for a preliminary organizational chart or diagram that depicts these changes and lays out the scenarios you are proposing. The diagram is one of the most helpful ways to explain how the governance structure will change. And we ask that the diagram be consistent with the narrative and other documentation. This particular diagram depicts an acquisition of a nonprofit institution by another nonprofit institution. The first column shows the existing structure. The second column shows some steps that will occur in the process to reach the final structure, which is shown in the far right-hand column. This shows a relatively simple change in structure, even though we absolutely know none of these transactions is simple. In this case, both institutions are nonprofit, and College A will acquire and completely absorb College B. In this case, there are no planned structural changes to the final governance structure. The conversion of a for-profit to a nonprofit would be much more complicated. It would have more interim steps in between the current and final structure, including the creation of a new nonprofit entity and most likely changes to shareholder agreements, just to provide an additional example. Related to governance, it is very important to identify all parties in the transaction and provide information on how the parties are structured, their type of ownership, and their accreditation status. This can provide the Commission with critical information about any major issues related to the member institution's accreditation or the transfer of accreditation. In some cases, member institutions have a related entity. That could be a corporate parent, system administration or board, religious sponsor, funding partner, or any other entity that can affect decisions related to accreditation. In this section of the form, you should include any related entity, and you will be asked additional questions about the role of the related entity in the transaction. If you do have a related entity, this is the perfect example of something you can speak to your Vice President Liaison about, who can provide more information and guidance. I will now hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Edna Corbett, who will discuss approvals and the next stages in the process.
Thank you, Tracy. At this point in the process, you should research and explore what other approvals will be necessary and provide this information in Section D. You will need to provide evidence and documentation of all required approvals. If they're not yet obtained, please provide them when they are available. The Commission will request follow-up information until they are submitted. An example of institutional approval are when the Board of Trustees' approval of the transaction is secured. If your institution is part of a system, those approvals may be required as well. Research and describe any state or other government agency requirements for this transaction. For example, if an institution will cease to exist legally because of the transaction, usually you must at least notify the state or may be required to dissolve its degree-granting authority. Also think about branch campuses and additional locations in other states. You may require their approval as well. As you can see on the screen, I have pointed out that if no approvals are necessary, you must include a letter from the state agency stating that no approvals are necessary, or provide a copy of the statute or regulation or other correspondence to that effect. A change of ownership usually has impact on Title IV, and at this point, you should begin to talk to the Office of Federal Student Aid. In some cases, the institution can apply for a pre-acquisition review with the United States Department of Education, which is designed to minimize disruption of Title IV funding. The Office of Federal Student Aid can provide information and guidance about that process. It is very important that you provide proper disclosures and make certifications. If any of these apply, provide adequate information and documentation to detail the facts and circumstances. The preliminary form should be signed by the Chief Executive Officer, Board Chair, and the proposed new owner if applicable. It does not need to be signed by another member institution since they are submitting their own form. The institution may submit the preliminary review form at any time during the year. This preliminary review form should be emailed to your Vice President Liaison. The next major component of the process is the submission of the Complex Substantive Change Request form. This form, number 2, is for change in legal status, form of control, or ownership, and it can be found on the Commission's website. We will not go into each section as we did with the preliminary review form because this is an iterative review. But I would like to note 3 important points about the submission of the Complex Substantive Change Request form. First, The request form asks the institution to highlight any updates or changes since the preliminary form was submitted. Describe those changes clearly, and draw direct parallels to the information submitted before. This is very helpful for review by Commission staff and peer evaluators. Don't forget to update the diagram of the changes to the governance structure. Second, the request form requires the institution to provide much more detail about its continued compliance with all of the standards for accreditation. This is where the institution will address questions about the transition and alignment of educational programming, assessment practices, student support services, the plan for faculty and staff, policy and procedures, finances, and the final governance structure. And third, if a member institution will cease to exist legally as part of the transaction, that institution must also submit a teach-out plan and agreements in conjunction with the request form. Documents that provide guidance for the submission of teach-out plans can be found on the Commission's Policies webpage, and the link is provided here on this slide. The institution must use the teach-out plans and agreements form to submit the required information to the Commission. I will add that the teach-out form requires an institution to think about the transition for students in a very detailed way. So be prepared to talk about where students are in completing their programs, the date they will transfer, how and where records will be kept. These are not easy questions, and they will require the institution involved in the transaction to work together on solutions that benefit and make accommodations for students. The institution should begin to sketch a preliminary timeline for the implementation of the proposed substantive change, identifying critical milestones that the institution must complete. We provided a sample here, which is not all-inclusive of every milestone, but we want to show you the kinds of milestones we're looking for. You can use a simple table, as provided here, or add a column to provide more detail. You can use a more graphic format or a project chart. The purpose is to think through a potential timeline of events for the institution. Most people have an anticipated final transaction date in mind, and then work backward from that date to develop the timeline. This should be a realistic timeline for the project and should include major milestones the institution needs to complete to implement the project. It will help to be aware of the legal documents that may be required for the type of transaction and account for the drafting, negotiations, and development of those documents. Account for communication checkpoints and necessary approvals from the state or reviews related to financial aid. Think about any teach-out requirements. As with any project, a good timeline is a tremendous asset to the process. The timeline will most certainly change as the transaction evolves, and we are aware of that. The timeline can be updated in the subsequent submission of the request form and by notifying your Vice President liaison. This preliminary information helps the Vice President to develop a schedule for the accreditation decision-making process, which I will show you next. As we mentioned earlier, the VP reviews the preliminary form and develops a schedule. This is a template of that schedule. I pulled out the schedule for the first component in this enlarged image, the review of the preliminary form. As you can see, only this first stage will take 2 to 3 months to complete. The VP will share this schedule with the institution, and it will be used as a guide for the rest of the process. The schedule will include all stages of the review to ensure that all steps in the multi-level accreditation decision-making process occur. I know the schedule is hard to see, but I think that helps to emphasize that there are many steps that need to be accounted for and that each schedule is dependent on the unique scenario. This schedule will provide a due date for the substantive change request form, which is the next major component of the process. You're probably aware that the Commission uses a multi-level decision-making process to ensure consistency, equity, and fairness. Peer evaluators will review the materials and may ask for additional information. When they are done, they will provide a review report which outlines their findings and provides a proposal for action. This is the first level of review. During the second level of review, all materials are reviewed by the Committee on Follow-up Activities. They will review the materials and render an independent decision, which they will propose to the Commission. In the third level of review is the Commission, and this is the decision-making body that produces the Commission action. Now I'm going to pass this on to my colleague Tracy Snyder for the next step.
Thank you, Edna. We know that all of this legal terminology can be confusing, and it's not easy to distinguish the type of transaction. Is it a merger, a consolidation? Could it be an acquisition? In the preliminary review form, we ask for you to identify the most appropriate type of transaction based on the legal documents and information that you have in hand. The substantive change guidelines provide information and some sample scenarios that could help. But please know this, you will not fail a quiz. The Commission will verify the type of transaction, and ultimately, the technical legal term for the transaction will be captured in the Commission's action language, which is also made publicly available. What is important for you to understand is that each one of these transactions is a legal transaction or a series of legal transactions. Being aware of this can help with creating a plan, setting a schedule, and accomplishing milestones. We understand that many of these terms are politically charged, and from an institutional perspective, there is a public relations component. So an important step for the institution is to develop an appropriate communication strategy that conveys necessary information to your constituencies. The Commission asks that you are aware of the technical nature of these transactions and that you provide accurate and consistent information. I mentioned earlier the importance of terminology. We recognize that the Commission's definition of a transaction may differ from those of other approving entities, including state and federal agencies. If you need to use a particular term for one entity and a different term for the Commission, we ask that you describe the reason why you are using these different terms and to be transparent with the Commission as to why certain terminology may be critical to your institution's successful navigation of its complex substantive change. I will now hand the remainder of the presentation to my colleague, Carmela Smith, who will discuss resources and concluding remarks.
Resources related to substantive change policies and other pertinent information are listed here for your reference. Please do not hesitate to contact your MSCHE Vice President Liaison with any questions. As we close, we would like again to thank our sponsor, Watermark, for bringing us today's webinar. You can learn more by visiting the Watermark booth in the exhibit hall at the 2022 MSCHE Annual Conference this December 7th through the 9th. We would like to thank you again for listening to this training.